Ulysses S. Grant is often seen as one of, if not the greatest military leader in American history. His impact as a general during the American Civil War, some argue, single-handedly won it for the North. His time during the war played a big part in shaping his Reconstruction mentalities during his post-war time as General-in-Chief under President Andrew Johnson, his rising political ambitions, and then becoming President of the United States from 1869 to 1877, known for his destruction of the Ku Klux Klan that last decades, defending the rights of Black Americans, and his pristine and good character. But how exactly was this fame gained? Did it begin during his service as infantryman in the Mexican-American War? While he certainly showed bravery, he never did gain national fame, until, inevitably, the American Civil War began. So, let's get right into it. How did Grant impact the Civil War? Well, in the early years, many Northern generals were rather incompetent or simply arrogant to late General George McClellan. Grant, however, was one of the few Northern generals winning battles and taking cities like Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in the West. During the Civil War, Grant has two campaigns that are the most famous: his campaign on Vicksburg and later the Overland Campaign. Here I will be examining and explaining Grant's Vicksburg campaign in detail and why it shows Grant's military genius and his hero status in American history. But why Vicksburg, of all things? Vicksburg during the Civil War essentially gave the Confederates control of the Mississippi River, and therefore control of a large section of the country. If the North could capture Vicksburg, they control the river and cut the Confederacy in two. This would cause supply lines, communication, travel, and many other things to be much more difficult with the Western Confederate States and the Eastern Confederate States. President Lincoln said Vicksburg is the key. More importantly, Confederate President Jefferson Davis called it the nailhead that holds the South's two halves together. As Grant continued to move further south after a series of Union victories under his command, he thought of multiple ways he could attack Vicksburg. He eventually planned on moving past Vicksburg, further south and crossing the Mississippi into Confederate territory. Grant secures support from a fleet of ironclad ships under Admiral David Porter, and in a risky move, moves them past Vicksburg even while they are being shot at. And it worked. Here, Grant puts his plan into full force. He orders General William Sherman to feign an attack just north of Vicksburg to divert troops away from the real attack under his own command at Grand Gulf. Grand Gulf fails, so Grant moves further south at Bruinsburg and is successful in crossing. The first battle takes place at Port Gibson under John McClernand, a Union victory. Now, Grant could attack Vicksburg directly, but not only would that be predictable, it would also be incredibly risky, as the terrain to the north is swampy and unfit for that type of campaign. Instead, Grant decides to attack a city just east of Vicksburg, Jackson. This city is an important supply line. If Grant takes it and blockades Vicksburg, the city will starve. The Confederate general, John Pemberton, decides to launch a counterattack. This fails, and the Battle of Raymond is another Union victory. The Confederates grow desperate. In an attempt to defend Jackson, the capital of Mississippi, Confederate General Joe Johnston tries to rally some reinforcements, but they will be too late on arriving, and he flees the city. Jackson falls May 14th. Grant is now eyeing up Vicksburg, completely isolated. General Pemberton sets up a quick defense around the city, in what becomes the Battle of Champion's Hill. Grant successfully flanks Pemberton's weak left, and forces Pemberton to retreat. Pemberton sets up another defense at Big Black River, another Confederate defeat. Pemberton loses a quarter of his army at Champion's Hill and Big Black River. Grant has successfully outmaneuvered Pemberton, and he retreats into Vicksburg. The key is close to falling into Union hands. Here we are at Vicksburg. Now Grant knows he could be in for a long siege. He attacks at the northern end of Vicksburg, but it fails. He tries a second attack, along a much larger front. It is nearly successful, but fails too. Now, Grant lays siege. Grant orders trenches dug facing Vicksburg and also facing his rear in case of a Confederate counter-siege maneuver by Joe Johnston. These trenches were not only dug by his soldiers, but also by free blacks, who were in fact being paid. Grant, in order to obtain a quick victory, tries some creative attack maneuvers. He orders the digging of a mine underneath the city, and then blows a big hole in it, causing chaos. The attack is a failure, but plays a big part in Confederate morale. Grant tries many more of these mining attacks around Vicksburg. Grant also keeps up constant pressure, cannon fire and Admiral Porter's ironclads firing from the river. Pemberton is being choked, his men are demoralized. They begin to threaten mutiny by saying, quote, "If you can't feed us, surrender us. Signed, many soldiers." Food is dangerously low. Men continue to desert Pemberton. The Confederates are being choked. Finally, after 47 days of no fresh supplies, starvation, and suffering, Pemberton knows he must surrender. Pemberton meets up with Grant to discuss terms of surrender. At first, Grant demands unconditional surrender, meaning everyone is taken their prisoner, but this is refused. Grant then offers a compromise through letter correspondence, instead paroling Pemberton's troops and letting them go home. They would never see conflict again because of their parole. Grant gives a list of what they're allowed to take. Officers can keep sidearms, cavalry officers can take one horse each, and everyone is allowed to take their clothing and food if they'd like, but nothing else. Pemberton then offers to allow them to take home all personal property, meaning slaves too, although slaves were never directly mentioned. Grant refuses, and demands they only take what he is allowing them to. Pemberton accepts. The city falls on the 4th of July, Independence Day. The Union now controls the Mississippi, and the Confederacy is greatly weakened because of it. Lincoln said that Mississippi, once again, is flowing, quote, unvexed to the sea. Later, Grant will embark on a great duel between himself and the best Confederate general, Robert E. Lee. This will end with Grant being victorious in taking the nearby city of Petersburg, slicing off Richmond's supply line, and then taking the capital of the Confederacy itself, Richmond. Very similar to his campaign in Vicksburg. These two victories, Vicksburg and Richmond, were a major part of what led to the Northern victory in the war, and Grant personally accepting Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. But what did Grant think about this terrible war? The bloodiest war in American history. Some have called Grant a butcher for taking such incredibly high losses and accusing him of having no care for human life. But Grant has often been characterized as being one of the most honest and decent men to serve as president, as he will later become, in American history. He wasn't always an abolitionist, but he would become one the more the Civil War dragged on. Interestingly enough, Grant didn't hate the South. He thought they were Americans who had gone astray. Despite having disagreements with them, most notably slavery and secession, he treated them humanely. He could have given harsh terms to Pemberton. He could have given harsh terms to Lee, but he didn't. He let them go home, and also let those who were enslaved go free, finally. He would take that into his presidency by sending in the military and issuing martial law in most cases when blacks were being brutalized and suppressed by racist whites. This is why me personally look up to Ulysses S. Grant, a hero, honorable, just, and decent. He did have his flaws. He had a drinking problem, which he would later conquer. He was naive, sometimes too kind and trusting to those who didn't deserve it, and wasn't a perfect general by any means. But I still think Grant should be remembered fondly in American history, for being a great leader for those he served with, the people he served, and the country he served. The country that remembers Ulysses S. Grant to this very day.